Hello everyone, my name is Ben, and this is the UnchartedX podcast. This podcast is episode number 3 in this current series of podcasts, and it's actually a podcast in which I do a real podcast. You'll hear me call it episode number 1. This was recorded back, I think, in January of 2019. It's my thoughts about perspective. It's a good primer for kind of how I approach many of the mysteries that we find in ancient architecture. But it was back when I really didn't quite understand how to build an audio-only podcast and how to get that distributed and put out. It ended up being turned into a video that's on YouTube, but it was intended as an audio-only resource. There is an associated video with this one that you can find. It's on my YouTube channel, as always. It's youtube.com/c/UnchartedX, or you can find all my work on the website, UnchartedX.com. And without any further ado, I hope you enjoy this podcast. Cheers. Hello everybody, and welcome to the UnchartedX podcast. This is episode 1, my reflections on perspective and a story about Nikola Tesla. I am a content creator that is making mini documentaries and short films and feature pieces about the mysteries of our past, the ancient sites that still confront us today. I will be using this podcast to do less structured content and also to do my interviews with, as I have many of those lined up with some of the authors and researchers that work in this field. You can find all of my content on my website, UnchartedX.com. I will be hosting a copy of this podcast also up on YouTube, and it will be set to some imagery, although it's certainly not required in order to view it. It is meant to be an audio-only presentation. And if you enjoy it and you want to give me any feedback, you can find me on my website, and I'm also active on Instagram and Twitter. Hey everyone, welcome to UnchartedX. This is Ben, and I want to do something a little different today and talk about perspective. Now, this isn't going to be a video about a specific historical site or an object. I'm working on plenty of those, but it's more of a conceptual thing, and I think perspective and understanding how we use perspective is a super important element to really understanding the past, and in particular, kind of understanding what is at least outside of our understanding. It's an interesting concept to think about. I kind of think of it as I call it our technological frame of reference. It's something we all have. It's how we go through society. It's how we navigate our daily lives. It's a common understanding between everyone of the world around us. In some ways, it's the sum total of our culture and the times that we live in. It's why we all know collectively what the internet is and what, microwaves are for. It's something that's common to everyone, and it's common to everybody that lives in this time. It's something that evolves and changes going forward in time, along with the mix of, really 3 or 4 generations of people that are really alive at any one time, right? People get born, people die. We only really have 3 or 4 generations of people, and this technological frame of reference that's mired in the now moves forward with them. You could imagine going back 500 or 1,000 years or even further, and then just taking your average villager from that time and transporting them to today. Nothing special, just transport them to just your average day in a city or in a populated area. You could imagine that just the cars, the roads that you drive on, the strip malls, the gas stations, all of that would just be alien, absolutely alien to this person, and let alone trying to get into actual technology, right? Space flight, airplanes, mobile phone, all that sort of stuff would be alien. So it's kind of interesting to think about how we unconsciously use this frame of reference, this perspective, to view everything that we look at around it. It pretty much informs everything we look at in the world. So if you haven't considered this concept, it can be a little jarring, at least at first. Think of it as the instinct to look at things, in particular things we don't really understand. And you could use some examples like ancient megalithic sites. And we try to project an understanding onto it. We look for answers of how it might have been made or what it might have been used for, its function. And we do that based on how and why we do the things we do today. Kind of like a camera lens, right? You look down a lens, you can't see outside of the lens, but everything you see through that lens, it's informed by that lens. Lenses can be different shapes, they can give you different effects, they can be at different levels. Think of it like that. So this perspective, the perspective of our own modern culture, our electromechanical, technological approach to problem solving, if you will, this is a reference frame for how we see the world. And I think it can and it absolutely does unconsciously warp our view of the past. So when we're confronted with some of the true mysteries of the past, we kind of automatically project our own perspective onto them. And we do that in the search for understanding and for explanation. It's a natural instinct. Now, we can look at some of these mysteries. In particular, I always start with what's my absolute favorite mystery, favorite example, is that it's a mystery how people that were barely out of the Stone Age, they emerged in the area of ancient Egypt, and somehow the immediate first thing they did was to build the greatest architectural achievements the world has ever seen in the Old Kingdom pyramids. They also immediately developed a full-blown theology. They had a symbolic language system that we are still trying to interpret properly today. They immediately created the intricate stone jars that are made from, some of the hardest materials found on Earth, like schist or corundum. Corundum's just, it's like a 9 on the Mohs scale, but they made jars out of that immediately. And these jars aren't rare, they're found by the thousands, tens of thousands even, and they were found under the very oldest of the pyramids we were talking about. Most of these jars were found under the Step Pyramid of Zoser. Or how they went and immediately created the massive, polished, and just mind-blowingly perfect geometric granite boxes that are found in various underground caverns all around that area. I mean, these are real achievements. These are achievements that we have never managed to replicate. We've never even come close in our modern Western civilization that's existed for thousands of years. Yet, apparently, the ancient Egyptians did all this as some of the very first tasks of their brand new civilization. They did this in the earliest periods of the so-called Old Kingdom time. Then their civilization declined technologically and culturally for 5,000 straight years. They never again reached those heights that they did in those first few dynasties. And they tried. I mean, they kept building pyramids, they kept building things in boxes, but go back, the first things they did were the most advanced and the biggest. I mean, is that really how civilization works? Or do you need to build up to such heights? Do we rise to these heights? The very idea that there was a highly advanced civilization that perhaps preceded the Egyptians and that they inherited these achievements from them, it's so far out of our current perspective on the world that it just gets outright dismissed by most people. And we just stick to that idea. We blithely accept the idea that the dynastic Egyptians just did it all, and that all of these sites were symbolic or religious sites, or they were tombs. And we do all this despite the savagely obvious inconsistencies and issues with that idea. And we do it because that's the only way it really makes sense from our current perspective, our own frame of reference. So there's other mysteries, right, all around the world that we try to solve using our own frame of reference, like the mystery of how a seemingly primitive culture carved the Cyclopean walls of Sacsayhuaman. I did a video recently on this. Or how they carved the walls of Cusco or Ollantaytambo. All of these things, these megalithic sites in Peru, and they all did this in only a few short decades. Another mystery, how a similar culture even thought up the enigmatic and incredibly precise works that still befuddle everybody that goes and visits Pumapunku in Bolivia. We have got that solved, according to our current perspective. Or yet another culture somehow quarried, moved, lifted, precisely placed the 900-ton trilithon stones at Baalbek, and they put them into such perfect placement that you can't fit a piece of paper in between them. Now, I don't think it was the Romans who later built their pedestal and then their Temple of Jupiter on top of these massive stones. And I think it's doubtful that the Romans even knew about some of the other quarried stones that are at that site. I mean, and we're talking about stones that weigh approximately 1,200 to 1,400 tons, which is damn near 3 million pounds. I mean, when we're confronted with these types of mysteries, we automatically try to understand them by using our own context, our own technology, and our own understanding of how these things have evolved over time. So the issue becomes, as anyone who has looked openly and honestly into these types of mysteries would already know, the official explanations we come up with really struggle to make any logical sense, and they don't feel right. Right? The idea that, yes, ancient people did this despite all the inconsistencies with that theory. Ancient primitive people did it. It doesn't feel right, but those are the explanations we stick to. It's as if we're trying to shove a square peg into a round hole, right? And it just doesn't fit. But despite the obvious incompatibility, we just doggedly keep on banging on that square peg, and we just insist on the validity of our explanations. Because those explanations are just the ones that make sense from within our perspective, and it's from within our perspective that we try to explain everything. I mean, we've never actually been able to replicate these types of works, and we've tried several times and failed every time. So is it not just as likely, if not even more likely, that in many of these cases there are other solutions to these problems? That, some of these achievements, some of these mysteries, like the pyramids, they may have actually been functional back in the past, and that function might explain their amazing precision, and that the solutions to these mysteries, they exist in domains of knowledge that we haven't yet discovered. Maybe it's domains of knowledge that we just don't fully understand yet. Perhaps, just perhaps, we did have such knowledge in the past, and perhaps these domains of knowledge once existed as part of the overall human knowledge base, and they were later lost in cataclysm or in fire. Perhaps our records of what really happened in the distant past, they're also lost, or maybe they're wrong, maybe they're just incomplete. But in reality, perhaps something else entirely was going on deep in the distant past, before the cataclysms that we now know happened at the end of the last ice age. I mean, it's like we automatically assume that people in the distant past and what they knew only represents a tiny subset of what we know today, and it's just not possible that they knew things that we don't. I mean, does that make any real sense? Think of it like this. Do you think that our knowledge of the universe is complete today? Or do you think that maybe in 50, 100, or could you imagine even 1,000 years from now, forward in time, we're going to understand more? I mean, our individual lives are so short in the context of our species timeline. Also, because the concept of mortality is so challenging to us, I think we unconsciously tend to view the social, the cultural, the technological norms of our time as somehow permanent and unchanging, when in reality they're fleeting in time and they're constantly changing. So grasping this concept that we unconsciously view the world and everything in it through a very particular lens, based on our own knowledge base, based on our current times, and then, when we're looking at historical mysteries, we need to mindfully be open to the idea that there are other perspectives, that there is perhaps evidence for things that have been going on that we can't explain using our perspective. And I think there's most definitely evidence for this. I think doing that is really key to truly understanding the past, and also to truly unlocking the wonder of the past, right? It's a thrilling feeling to look at some of these achievements and to truly grasp that it's beyond our understanding, which means it's more advanced. It could be more advanced than we are. I mean, that's an exciting concept. It makes you want to go and find out what that truth is, right? Rather than saying, yeah, everybody, it was beer and blankets and copper chisels, bro, and we built everything. Shit on you! That's less exciting. So I think the reality is that our understanding of the world it's temporary, right? It's based on our current time, our current understandings. And I think this frame of reference has most likely nothing, absolutely nothing to do with the reality of what we're looking at and how it was looked at in its original context with the people who built it and made it for something. We don't know what that context is. I kind of have two good examples to illustrate this concept. So the first way to think about it is consider the last 50 years of technological growth, right? We've become accustomed to rapid advances in technology. This is the rate of pace and the rate of change of technology. We've become accustomed to this. It's something that just we take for granted now. In particular, areas like technology itself, computers, mobile phones, and even the fundamental development of the internet. It's changed our society, it's changed how we communicate, it's changed how we do almost everything. But we all know this, so it seems normal. How we learn, how we interact, is everything. This is a concept that is brand new. It's even a word that's brand new, right? If you go back in time, this is not something you could easily explain. Very few people even predicted it correctly. So, when we learn something new and groundbreaking, like the internet, when that happens, we don't really think all that much of it anymore, right? We're just kind of used to this rapid advance of technology now. But what would happen if you could take a bunch of this gear, phones, computers, go back into only 40 years, 30, 40 years back, And if you would just ask your random person on the street to explain it, or get them to explain the concept of the internet before the internet was around, I think their answers would be radically different to what we know now, right? I don't think they would be able to explain it well. So in the same vein, in the same topic, do you think that our technology has absolutely peaked? Do you think we've reached the pinnacle of what we can achieve with technology? Or do you think that in 100 years we'll have an entirely different perspective on technology? We'll have an entirely different perspective on the world around us and the makeup of the cosmos even. I think that if you or I were somehow able to look 100 years into the future, we would have no chance to explain what we're seeing. We just don't have the correct frame of reference to view it in, right? We might as well be a frog trying to explain an iPhone. I mean, there's countless examples of this. I mean, my background's in computer science and engineering, and it's, the N-type and P-type transistors that create binary logical circuitry and combine that in the millions of transistors into these things we now just take for granted and call integrated circuits, and they're in absolutely everything. This is a completely alien concept, and we've built this up to run the world and do everything, and it's an incredible achievement, and it's happened within only a couple of decades. It's unbelievable, and that's just the last couple of decades. Never mind we're working on graphene and quantum computing and things that will also then fundamentally change that. This is it's an unbelievable time to live in. Before I get into the second example and my story about Tesla, I wanted to take a moment to just give a heartfelt thank you to a few people, in particular Chuck over at the CFAPS 7865 channel, or CFAPS 7865. He's been a great friend, really. Even though I have not met him, we've just corresponded a few times. I really enjoy his work. He gave the channel a bump when I was just getting started on this new channel, and it kind of went from 40 to over 600 subs overnight, so thank you to him. And obviously thank you to all the people that came from his channel. I'd also like to say thank you to everybody that came over from Pukajay. I posted an update that put links to both my work and Luke's work, and I'd like to thank everybody that came over from that audience. It's greatly appreciated. And as I'd like the channel to keep growing, it obviously really helps me out if you like this content, if you subscribe to it, and in particular if you share it out to your own circles. Ultimately, I'm creating all this content for you, for this audience, for people that are interested in these types of topics. And I think there's a ton of room for high quality content that addresses a lot of these issues and a lot of these mysteries that we're looking at. And I've got a whole massive library of footage and film and resources to do that with. I have a long plan to do a lot of stuff. I am looking for some support to make this happen. The model that I'd like to try and use is something called the value for value model, and it's a model that was created by the best podcast in the universe, frankly. It's the No Agenda Show. And this model goes along the lines of that if you get any value from my work, then it's probably worth giving some value in return. Now that value could be feedback, it could be commentary, it could be you sharing that video out, or it could be more direct support on the crowdfunding site Patreon. I have a page on Patreon. It's patreon.com/UnchartedX. And I have tiers starting as low as $3 per month for basic support. They go up through $6 and then $9 per month. At $6, I will be taking questions and addressing them in podcasts and future video work. And at $9 per month, I will be doing that also, as well as giving you access to the ability to download unwatermarked full-size imagery from my image gallery from all around the world. There's more than 16,000 images on my website, on my image gallery, and I'm always curating it. You can get at that image gallery and have a look at it. It's on UnchartedX.com. If you're as against Patreon's trust and safety team and the way they've treated other creators like Sargon of Akkad, then I'm also on Subscribestar as an alternative, subscribestar.com/UnchartedX. So if you like this content, please consider supporting me through either of those mechanisms. Consider the amount of money you might spend on a cup of coffee in an average week, or perhaps the price of a movie ticket for entertainment's purposes. Hopefully you get some value from my work, and I'd love it if you could give me some value back. If you don't like the idea of subscriptions, then you can also support me directly via PayPal. It's paypal.me/UnchartedX. And if you leave me a PayPal donation, anything above $10, if you leave me a note, I'll read that note on podcasts, and I will most certainly address any questions or topics that you'd like me to as a thank you for doing that. So that's all I wanted to say here. Thanks again to all the people that have left comments for me and that are supporting me. I really do appreciate it. And if you're enjoying this content, please do consider the value for value model, and back to the podcast. So my other example is a good one, because this it's an example of how we will, in the near future, fundamentally change our understanding of some basic principles. And it kind of gets into an interesting story, and it's a story about Nikola Tesla. So many people know about Nikola Tesla, the famous scientist who lived around the turn of the 20th century and did a lot of work. He died in 1943. Now, Tesla built something at Wardenclyffe on the East Coast, which many people will remember. It's called a Tesla Tower, and it was supposedly at the time a tower that was made to deliver free energy in a wireless fashion to everyone in the world. This is an amazing concept, right? And it wasn't, for whatever reason, JP Morgan, there's an entire internet hole to go down if you want to look at this, but it eventually got tore down to satisfy his debts, and we never saw that technology again. Until today, actually. Because today, right now in Texas, there's a company that has built a Tesla tower. And, believe it or not, they are able to send power wirelessly to anywhere on the planet. And it's a company, you can look them up. They're called Viziv Technologies, V-I-Z-I-V. They have written a few papers about what they're doing. And they've got an interesting history. I'll get into that in a minute. But so something to understand is that this is essentially it's incredible, but what we're looking at is just the evolution of electromagnetic wave theory, right? So ever since we have used electricity to communicate, to send power, to every time, as we manipulate electricity for everything, including antennas, it all runs on a theory of electromagnetic wave propagation called Hertzian wave theory, and this is where the term Hertz comes from. And effectively, this is the way that we use conductive material in a wire to then send a signal down. Now, if it's an unshielded wire, you use those sort of things for antennas. If it's a shielded wire, those are power cables. Think of it like that. Everything that uses electricity to communicate or to send power, it all runs on this Hertzian wave theory of electromagnetic wave propagation. There was two competing theories for this back when it was being developed. And then there was another theory called Zenneck surface wave theory. And this was dismissed at the time for various reasons. However, it has since been re-established in recent times. It's also the theory upon which Tesla's wireless power system worked. And Zenneck surface waves is not Hertzian wave theory. We do not require wires. Zenneck surface wave theory works on the basis that you can now send electromagnetic waves and you can propagate them through the interface between, say, the air and the ground. And in practice, what this means is that you can use the entire surface of the Earth. So when you initiate a Zenneck surface wave, it can effectively travel across the entire surface of the Earth. Think of it as inflating a balloon that basically surrounds the entire Earth, and that becomes your transmission medium. So instead of requiring wires or antennas or any conductive materials, you're not using Hertzian wave theory with Zenneck surface waves. You are using the interface between the ground and the air. So natural materials can now be a transmission medium for electricity or signals. And it does this in a very, very efficient manner. You can't get shocked by this. It doesn't give off radiation. So high power line, people don't like living under high voltage power lines. And antennas, I mean, we take advantage of the fact that with Hertzian wave theory, it gives off radiation. That's how we send signals through the air. We're basically radiating from an antenna. You don't have radiation with Zenneck surface waves. You can't get shocked with Zenneck surface waves. Storms and natural events can't take out a signal from Zenneck surface waves because it is traveling through the entire surface of the Earth. You don't require satellites anymore to relay signals. You don't require line of sight. You're effectively using the entire surface of the Earth. It's quite an interesting concept. It's, in its own way, just mind-blowing. But one thing that it will do is when this becomes the norm, and I believe this will happen in the next 5 to 10 years, this is going to fundamentally change the way that we think about electricity, we think about signals, and the way that we think about doing anything with electricity. You don't require wires, you don't require a grid across a country. Now you can have a power generator with a Tesla tower. Let's say it's a nuclear power plant. You put it in a geologically stable region that doesn't suffer earthquakes. It's not near a coastline like Japan or something like that. Or you've got a giant solar collector station that's in the middle of the desert, someplace that receives sun every day of the year. You can put a tower there and you can send that power through the surface of the Earth in a highly, highly efficient manner and just put a receiver somewhere, anywhere on the planet, and power up a microgrid. That's Zenneck surface waves. But what it fundamentally allows us to do, it will change our perspective on electricity. So no longer do we require wires, do we require satellites, do we need to send things through the air. You just plug in, put a receiver anywhere on the planet, and away you go. Now, a little bit more about this company. You can go and look it up. They're not hiding this. They've built a tower. It's in Texas. There are YouTube videos that will show you this tower. It looks just like the Tesla tower that was built at Wardenclyffe. Their name is Viziv Technology, V-I-Z-I-V, technologies.com, I think it is. They've got some papers. They've presented some of this material to the IEEE. I was part of the IEEE in my last career, or my hiatus from IT. But it's just a step forward in terms of technology, and it's a good example of how our perspectives change over time. Just out of interest, though, it is kind of interesting to see where this came from. If you actually go and investigate Viziv Technologies, you'll find that their executive leadership, they're all retired ex-military types. In fact, there were, I think, high-level Air Force and Navy generals and admirals. And these guys were probably likely around the time when Tesla died, which was in the 40s. There's actually an FBI report that talked about after his death, they had an interview with the guy that ran a storage house, a storage facility, and he recalled that after Tesla died, you had blue suited or blue, uniformed people, so high-level military, either Navy or Air Force, went through all of his storage lockers, photographed everything, took all of his research. As people probably know, most of Tesla's work was eventually classified by the FBI. The FBI also knows that the military was involved, and that they got a handle on all of his work. And what I think's happened is that these guys have been working on this for 40 years, 50 years, and that research is now just coming to fruition. So this is what we're seeing, is that some of Tesla's work now is becoming productized, and you've got guys that are using that technology now as an alternative to power distribution. It's incredible. It's a very interesting development that's worth looking into. And this isn't a conspiracy or anything. These guys aren't hiding it. I think this is just the next step in terms of electromagnetic wave propagation. But again, the example why I like to use it is because of how it changes our perspective on electricity and power usage. Now, all of a sudden, we're talking about using natural materials to conduct electricity with a different theory of electromagnetic wave propagation. So what does this mean? We don't know what it means. It has all sorts of implications when we look back at the past. Just imagine that this was something that an ancient civilization knew about. Now, all of a sudden, you're looking at megalithic sites that have many different types of natural materials aligned in really interesting ways. If you go back on the Pukajay channel and you look at one of the interviews we did some electromagnetic induction testing of different types of stone with Yusuf and Muhammad over there in Egypt. They have an EMI box that we could then test different types of stone, like granite, basalt, limestone, and they had different properties when it came to electromagnetic induction. And you could actually see this in terms of arcing electricity and then types of, on limestone, for example, and then granite, which acted as a conductor. Then you go to these ancient sites, places like Abu Sir in particular, and you have basalt that's been encased in limestone. And the basalt, it shows signs of heat cycles. This is fairly interesting, but we don't know what it means. However, as our perspective changes and we learn more about the world, we learn more about fundamental theories with physics. All of this opens up doors, and it opens up opportunities to re-examine a lot of these sites. But you have to have the perspective that perhaps what they were doing was outside of our understanding, and that's just not something that the orthodox establishment is willing to admit, right? They all have the answers. We know it was primitive people. We know they did it with beer and blankets and copper chisels and hemp rope. And it was all made because it was ceremonial. That's why they carved and moved 70 and 100-ton blocks of granite and basalt and hugely difficult tasks like that, just because they wanted it to look nice and they wanted it to be ceremonial. It's absolute garbage, but in order to even think about these alternative theories, you first have to step outside of your own perspective. And that's kind of why I want to talk about perspective. So overall, our lives, they're temporary things. We're firmly mired in the nowness of civilization in terms of how we think and the way things are. And we think that the way things are now are the way they've always been. That's just an assumption you tend to make going through life. Yet, our brief time in these bodies, our brief time on this planet, it only represents a tiny fraction of what has been or what will be. So to me, it seems pretty arrogant to project our own electromechanical, technological frame of reference onto the past and expect that to just explain it all away and to give us all the answers, as if everyone from all time has thought and acted in the same direction that we do. We have the ability to make incredible materials. In our search for strength and for lightweight, we create composite materials and steel and all sorts of amazing materials to then go and do construction with and create our objects with. Yet, if you could imagine somebody else having a better control over organic material and the ability to move and quarry and manipulate organic material like very hard types of stone, like different types of stone, and to take advantage of their different properties, and to make things solidly and to do it with less effort than it would take us to do similar things, then you wouldn't need to make composite and advanced materials because you had the ability to work with organic materials. I mean, that's a possibility. Again, it sits outside of our current understanding, but it's actually a possibility when you consider what we're looking at on these ancient sites. So stepping outside of our frame of reference is a difficult thing to do, but it's something we should always strive to do, particularly when we're looking at a real mystery that comes to us from a different time period. And it's something that I try to do. It's something that I'm trying to make a part of my work. I mean, I think it's a fundamental piece of the puzzle when you're looking at these ancient sites. Something that I try to steer away from is the idea that, we are more advanced. We are a more advanced culture, therefore we must know the answer. This is what happens with anthropologists to some degree, and it's an example that's very well illustrated in one of my favorite books of all time, Cosmic Serpent, DNA and the Origins of Knowledge by Jeremy Narby. But he talks about anthropologists. I mean, to be an anthropologist, to study other forms of humanity, you have to look at it from a certain perspective, and ultimately that perspective has to be that you're superior to the other cultures, and therefore you can then categorize other cultures in terms of your culture and in terms of things that matter to our culture. And what happens and has happened with several anthropologists that have then gone to spend time, and in particular I'm talking about cultures like the Shipibo and the native Indian cultures that live in the Amazon jungle, is that over time you begin to understand, and I guess this only happens when you experience it to this degree, but I can understand it at a certain level. The anthropologists understand that in some ways these cultures are more advanced than our culture, the way that they store knowledge. I mean, every form of pharmaceutical has more or less been ripped off from the native people of the Amazons, and it's inherent cultural knowledge that they've had. I mean, all forms of anesthetic have come from curare, which is a really strange combination of ingredients when you get down into it in terms of process, and they'll tell you their gods told them that. I mean, it's a whole other discussion around psychedelics and theogens and things. But for anthropologists, it breaks their minds when they all of a sudden realize that in some ways what looks like from our perspective a primitive culture is in many ways more advanced than our culture. All of a sudden the whole meaning of anthropology goes out the window because you can't put that culture into any context that makes sense from within our own culture, right? And they give up the profession and they understand there's this fundamental arrogance that comes from calling yourself an anthropologist. Not to say that some things don't have metrics and can't be assigned values, but there are things that sit outside of our perspective and our collective knowledge base. And when you run into those things, the first thing and the best thing you can do is to admit it, right? Is to then admit it, because ultimately that answer becomes, I don't know, or I don't understand this. And it opens up the door to then an open-minded approach to search for the answer, instead of just determining that you must have the answer because we are superior. And this same thing happens in the field of history to me. I mean, this is what most of the establishment does, is that they only look at this stuff from within that one perspective, when I think the answer to most of it, certainly the megalithic stuff, or the huge mysteries like the pyramids and a lot of what happens in Egypt, South America, Baalbek, etc., that all sits, I think, outside of our perspective. Not to say that we won't find the answer eventually. I think we will if we keep looking. But we have to look in an open-minded manner, because if we just decide that this is all copper chisels and ropes and beer and blankets and, it's time and effort. That's Zahi Hawass told us this when we asked him in Egypt.
The most important thing, as I told you today, if you try to build a pyramid today, you will never do it, because you don't have the idea that the Egyptian had, the national project.
But he says, it was a national project. That's how they got the pyramids done. It was a national project, bro. Everybody got behind it, and we just bent our will and our entire civilization towards it. And kind of the example I'd use is the moon landings. You know, this is something that we did 50 plus years ago, but it doesn't seem to be something we can do now. Like it's something that happened back in the past, but there's no way in hell we could do this right now if we wanted to.
Shame on you!
And it was definitely a national project, right? There was huge portions of the economy and a lot of our, at least America's, I'm not American, but a lot of America's national effort went towards it, certainly at a bigger percentage than we give to NASA at the moment. But it simply wasn't a case of people collectively coming together and all of the people in America collectively threw some astronauts at the moon. No, there was technology involved. There was science. Without these technological and highly advanced aspects and parts of that effort, it simply wouldn't have happened. You can't just will it into existence without technology. And you're looking at the same things. Like those pyramids didn't just happen because people put their effort into it. The degree of precision that is shown on those objects, as well as the boxes in the Serapeum and in so many other places, does not happen without some highly advanced technology, highly advanced planning, and things that we simply cannot attribute to those ancient cultures. Therefore, they're the proof that there was high technology, right? You just have to consider that perhaps the answer lays outside of our own frame of reference. Anyhow, I think this stepping outside of our own frame of reference, out of our own perspective, is a difficult thing to do. It's something we should always strive to do, particularly when we're looking at the real mysteries that come to us from other time periods. So people reach for answers, right? This is what happens. We see this with everybody, whether it's aliens or it's giants or it's angels or it's magic and crystals and just strange things. I'm all for those theories. I am all for them, but you need to come with proof. I am open-minded, and I believe everyone should be certainly open-minded to those things being real, but condition zero is that they are not real, and you have to prove that they are real. You have to bring the proof. It's the same thing with God, right? You have to prove that he exists. Don't tell me to prove that he doesn't. That's not a negative that is possibly provable. This is the stupid argument everybody has about this topic. My point is that people reach for answers from within our perspective, and it's very obvious to see them doing that, particularly when you see all the different attempts that we have to explain these things, and none of these attempts make any sense, right? None of these explanations for the pyramids or things really make any sense, and I think that's because the true answer does not lie within our current frame of understanding. Anyhow, the power in truly understanding perspective, I think, is in realizing exactly that, when the answer lies outside of it. And the only true answer is, I don't know. And I think by acknowledging the I don't know on these sites, it also unlocks the true mystery, the true wonder, and the thrill of understanding that, particularly when you're looking at the incredible works of these ancient people. At least it does for me. And perhaps, and I hope, that we will know the answers to these things sometime in the future. Our understanding of the universe is ever increasing at a rapid rate. But in the meantime, don't fall victim to that fallacy that we must know the answers, and that all that the answers must lie within our current set of understanding, because then you're just a frog trying to explain an iPhone. Thanks for listening.